Hello, sir, may I help you? 5 simple words, spoken with trembling hands in the language of silence. In the gleaming, cold marble lobby of Reynolds Media Corporation, a shy girl named Milan was about to discover that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the loudest echoes. But she didn't know that yet. She didn't know that this heartwarming encounter would prove that the most inspirational moments happen exactly when we least expect them. And the person who needed to witness it most? He was standing right there in the shadows, watching every single gesture. Milan Collins pressed herself against the lobby's far wall, clutching her clipboard like a shield. At 24 years old, this shy girl had perfected the art of invisibility. In this glass tower, ambition always echoed louder than empathy. For 3 months, she had navigated the marketing department's ruthless energy, learning the hard way that quiet kindness was often mistaken for weakness, especially by colleagues like Elodie. Elodie, whose sharp tongue seemed designed to cut down anyone she perceived as competition. The morning calm was shattered by the receptionist's frustrated voice. "Sir, I am sorry, but I don't understand what you are trying to tell me." A distinguished man in his 30s stood before the marble desk. His hands were moving in elegant, desperate gestures. His eyes held that specific, patient sadness of someone accustomed to being misunderstood. Milan's heart clenched in her chest. She recognized that look. It was the same resigned disappointment she had seen in her younger brother Danny's eyes countless times. The same helpless frustration that had driven her to learn sign language at 13 years old, sitting cross-legged on her bedroom floor, practicing until her fingers could speak what her voice couldn't always convey. Love, understanding, you matter. Her hands tingled with the familiar urge to help, but doubt crept in like ice water. This wasn't her place. She was nobody here, just an intern who brought coffee and made copies. Yet watching this man's shoulders slump with each failed attempt at communication felt like watching Danny all over again. Small, unheard, alone in a world too busy to listen, taking a breath that felt like stepping off a cliff. Milan moved forward, her hands lifted, fingers shaping words with fluid grace. "Hello, sir, may I help you?" The man's face transformed. It lit up like a sunrise breaking through storm clouds. "Thank you," he signed back, the relief evident in his posture. "I thought no one here would understand me." The entire lobby fell silent. The frantic typing, the phone calls, the murmurs, it all stopped, stunned by this unexpected display of compassion and competence. But Milan, focused entirely on the man, didn't see the figure who had just emerged from the executive elevator. She didn't notice the piercing gaze of Lawrence Reynolds, the CEO of the very empire surrounding them. Lawrence stood frozen, witnessing something he thought no longer existed in the corporate world. What hidden pain was this powerful man carrying? And how would Milan's simple act of kindness crack open wounds he'd spent years sealing shut? Milan's conversation with the man, whose name was Mark, continued. Her hands moved with increasing confidence as she learned he was an art entrepreneur seeking a partnership for a community accessibility project. It was a beautiful moment, a moment of pure connection, but her moment of triumph was about to be shattered by the very forces she had hoped to avoid. "Well, well," the voice cut through the lobby like a blade. It was Elodie. "Look who's decided to play translator." Milan's face flushed crimson as heads turned their way. Elodie's public humiliation was a calculated strike, designed to reduce Milan's moment of connection to mere attention-seeking behavior. "I was just helping," Milan began, her voice small, but Elodie's cruel smile stopped her cold. "Helping, or overstepping boundaries that exist for good reasons. We have professional interpreters for actual client communications, Milan. This isn't some charity case for you to practice on." Mark's expression darkened. Even without hearing Elodie's words, he read the hostile body language. He saw the cruelty. Milan's hands trembled as she interpreted the exchange for him, softening Elodie's malice. even as her own confidence crumbled into dust. From his vantage point near the elevators, Lawrence observed the dynamics with laser focus. He had built his empire by reading people, by understanding the subtle power plays that determined who rose and who fell. What he saw now was achingly familiar, raw talent being crushed by those who confused volume with value. The marketing manager approached, drawn by the commotion. "Milan, I need to speak with you about interfering in matters above your role. Client relations require proper protocols." Milan felt the familiar urge to disappear, to become small, to become invisible again. She nodded mutely, her brief moment of visibility already transforming into public shame. As the crowd began to disperse, she caught Mr. Parker's gentle gaze from his security post. The elderly guard had been watching the entire exchange with the wisdom of someone who'd spent decades observing human nature. Once an art teacher before budget cuts forced him into security work, he possessed an uncanny ability to see potential where others saw only problems. "Miss Milan," he called softly as she passed his desk, "don't be afraid of doing what's right. That man saw you, and so did I." His words followed her to the elevator, but she rode in silence to the marketing floor, certain her brief moment of courage had cost her more than she could afford. But what Milan didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Lawrence Reynolds had just made a decision that would change everything. "Send Milan Collins to my office," he told his assistant. His voice carried an authority that brooked no argument. 20 minutes later, Milan sat across from the most powerful man in the building. Her hands were folded in her lap like a schoolchild awaiting punishment. Lawrence's office was a monument to success. Floor-to-ceiling windows, prestigious awards, photographs of corporate victories. But it was strangely devoid of personal touches. It was as if the man who worked here had systematically removed every trace of humanity from his environment. "Why do you know sign language?" Lawrence asked without preamble. His steel-gray eyes studied her with uncomfortable intensity. Milan's voice barely rose above a whisper. "My brother is deaf. I learned so I could talk to him." Lawrence leaned back. Something flickered behind his controlled expression. The silence stretched between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. "Tell me about him," Lawrence said. Milan heard something unexpected in his voice. Not the corporate authority she had braced for, but something softer, more vulnerable. "Danny is 16, she began, her voice growing stronger as love overcame fear. "He was born deaf. For years, our family struggled with communication. I started learning sign language when I was 8 because I couldn't bear watching him feel left out of conversations, isolated in his own home." Lawrence's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a barely perceptible softening. This shy girl had no idea that her simple story was touching something deep within the hardened executive. "Your dedication to your brother is remarkable," Lawrence said finally. "That kind of commitment to family speaks to character." Milan sensed there was more beneath his words, layers of meaning she couldn't quite grasp, but she also felt something unexpected. This conversation wasn't the reprimand she had feared. Instead, it felt like an assessment, as if Lawrence was measuring something in her that went beyond job performance. "From now on," Lawrence continued, "I'll be observing your work more closely, not as punishment, but as evaluation." Milan left that meeting with her head spinning, unsure whether she had been warned or encouraged. But she did notice something changing in the days that followed. Lawrence would appear at marketing meetings, his presence commanding attention, while his gaze often found her, studying her interactions, her problem-solving, her natural empathy. Meanwhile, Elodie's jealousy was growing into something dangerous. She began spreading whispers about favoritism, about unqualified interns getting special treatment. Her schemes to edge Milan out of projects became increasingly bold, as if she sensed that time was running out to eliminate this unexpected threat. How could Milan have known that her greatest test was still coming? and that failure would threaten not just her job, but her faith in the very kindness that defined her. The test came sooner than anyone expected. 3 days later, during the most important presentation of the quarter, disaster struck. Mark had returned for a formal meeting with the marketing team, and the professional interpreter was caught in traffic, running dangerously late. "We can't postpone," Lawrence announced, his voice carrying the weight of corporate deadlines and million-dollar decisions. "The marketing team will need to handle communications until our interpreter arrives." Elodie seized her moment like a predator, sensing weakness. "Milan, she's just an intern, sir. She'll ruin it. This is too important for amateur hour." But Lawrence's gaze found Milan across the conference room. "Milan, you're up." The words hit her like lightning. Every eye in the room turned toward her, measuring, judging, waiting for her to fail. Milan's legs felt like water as she stood. Her hands were already beginning to tremble with the weight of expectation. Mark smiled encouragingly, but Milan could barely see him through the fog of her own panic. This wasn't a quiet conversation in a lobby. This was a formal presentation with department heads, profit margins, and her entire future hanging in the balance. She began to sign, but her nerves overwhelmed her immediately. Her hands shook, making her usually fluid gestures awkward and uncertain. She stumbled over technical terms. She mixed up simple phrases. She watched in horror as confusion flickered across Mark's face. Muffled laughter rippled through the room. Someone whispered, "I told you so." Elodie's smirk was visible in Milan's peripheral vision, a silent victory dance. "I'm sorry," Milan whispered, her voice cracking. I need a moment." She fled. She ran to the women's restroom, tears streaming down her face as the familiar walls of her old sanctuary welcomed her back. This was where she belonged. Hidden, small, invisible. How had she ever thought she could be anything more? The door opened softly. Familiar footsteps approached. Mr. Parker's gentle voice called through the stall door. "Miss Milan, I brought you something." She opened the door to find the elderly security guard holding a clean handkerchief, his weathered face full of grandfatherly concern. "No one gets it right the first time," he said. "The person who truly saw you today was you. You saw someone who needed help and you stepped forward. That's not failure, Milan. That's courage." His words wrapped around her like armor, but Milan wasn't sure she had the strength to try again. What if I'm not good enough? What if Elodie is right and I'm just fooling myself? Mr. Parker's eyes twinkled. "Miss Milan, I taught art for 37 years. You know what I learned? The students who worried most about being good enough were always the ones who cared the most. And caring, that is where real talent begins." What happened next was nothing short of inspirational. When Milan returned to the conference room, the professional interpreter had arrived and taken over. But something remarkable occurred that no one had anticipated. Mark was watching her with intense interest. Lawrence was taking notes with unusual focus. The energy in the room had shifted completely. "Milan," Mark said, his hands moving with deliberate clarity as the professional interpreter translated, "I'd like to request you specifically for tomorrow's private meeting. Just us." The room went silent. In 20 years of business, Mark had never made such a specific personnel request. The professional interpreter looked stunned. Elodie's face went pale. "Are you certain?" Lawrence asked, his voice carefully neutral. Mark's response was immediate. "I've worked with many interpreters. Most translate words perfectly. But Milan translates something more important. She translates intention and emotion. That is what this project needs." Milan felt the ground shift beneath her feet. This man, this successful entrepreneur, was choosing her because of the humanity she brought to the interaction. Lawrence's expression revealed nothing, but those who knew him well might have noticed the slight tightening around his eyes. "Tomorrow then," he said. "Milan, my office first. We need to discuss your expanded responsibilities." As the meeting concluded, Milan realized something profound. Her failure hadn't ended her story. It had somehow become the very thing that proved her worth. Authenticity mattered more than perfection, but she also sensed that Lawrence's interest in her went deeper than professional competence. What secrets was Lawrence hiding, and how would tomorrow's private meeting reveal truths that would change everything? The next morning, Milan found herself in Lawrence's office before sunrise. "There's something you need to understand about yesterday," Lawrence began. "Mark's request wasn't random. He believes authentic humanity is rarer than technical perfection. Everyone in that room saw a young woman struggling and chose to judge. Everyone except you, who chose vulnerability." He stood and moved to the windows. "Your situation reminds me of something I experienced years ago, a corporate betrayal that nearly destroyed my faith in human decency." It was the first crack in his perfectly controlled facade. The private meeting with Mark later that morning was magic. In the quiet of the conference room, Milan interpreted with growing confidence. She began to anticipate Mark's needs, adding subtle emotional context that transformed mere translation into genuine connection. "Never be afraid when you already have the language of the heart," Mark signed. Then he dropped the bombshell. "Milan, this project isn't just about accessibility. It's about creating a model that other companies will follow. And models require leaders, people who understand inclusion as a lived experience." Lawrence leaned forward. "What are you proposing, Mark?" "I'm proposing that Milan lead the entire communications initiative, not as an intern, but as director of a new department within Reynolds Media." Milan's hands froze. "Director? Her? That's impossible," she whispered. "Chad, I don't have the credentials." "You have something better," Mark interrupted. "You have authenticity. Technical skills can be taught. Instinctive empathy cannot." Lawrence was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a resonance that suggested this decision meant more to him than corporate strategy. "Mark is right. The question isn't whether you deserve this opportunity, Milan. The question is whether you're brave enough to accept it." "But what about Elodie?" Milan asked. "The others?" "Excellence always provokes criticism from mediocrity," Lawrence replied. Walking out of that room, Milan felt like a different person, but she also sensed that their moment of triumph was about to face its greatest test. Elodie's jealousy had reached dangerous levels. The contract signing ceremony was meant to be a celebration, but the air was thick with tension. Elodie had positioned herself near the back, her smile sharp as a blade. She had spent the week planting seeds of doubt, building a case that favoritism had corrupted the company. Just as Mark began his closing remarks, Elodie's voice cut through the proceedings. "I'm sorry," she said, standing up, "but I think we need to address the elephant in the room. Milan is just faking it. She's nothing but lucky. And we are about to sign a multi-million-dollar contract based on amateur theatrics." The room went dead silent. Milan felt the familiar urge to shrink, but something had fundamentally changed in her core. Instead of crumbling, she stood straighter. Her hands continued to move with steady grace as she interpreted Elodie's venomous words for Mark. Mark's response was immediate and devastating. He rose to his full height. Through Milan's clear interpretation, his words rang out like a bell. "This company doesn't need perfection. It needs people who listen with their hearts." Milan doesn't just interpret language, she interprets humanity. When I speak about barriers, she conveys my frustration, my hope. That is not luck. That is a rare gift. The room erupted in applause, but it was Lawrence's response that sealed Elodie's fate. He stood slowly, his authority filling the space like a thunderstorm. "Milan will lead communications for this initiative," he declared. "And anyone who questions that decision is questioning my judgment. As for unprofessional behavior during client presentations, that will be addressed immediately." Elodie's face went ashen. Her calculated strike had backfired spectacularly. As the crowd dispersed, Lawrence approached Milan. His expression was softer than she had ever seen it. "You remind me of my daughter," he said quietly. Milan looked up, startled. "She once signed to me, 'Dad, trust me.' I didn't listen. I was too busy, too important. I focused on everything except what mattered most." Lawrence's voice cracked with the weight of old grief. "But today, I trust you, not because you're perfect, but because you understand that communication is about connection." Milan's eyes filled with tears. "I'm not trying to be a hero, Mr. Reynolds. I just don't want anyone left behind." 1 month later, everything had changed. The accessibility initiative had transformed the company. The shy girl who once pressed herself against lobby walls now commanded respect in boardrooms. Her office, her actual office, overlooked the lobby where it all began. From his security desk, Mr. Parker watched Milan pass through the morning crowds, radiating confidence. He smiled, whispering words meant for no one but heard by the universe. Finally, she is seen. The cold corporate machine had developed a heart. Elodie was gone, and a new culture of collaboration had emerged. Danny, Milan's brother, visited often, watching with pride as his sister led meetings where sign language was treated with equal respect. At the project launch event, Milan took the stage. Lawrence sat in the front row, watching her with a father's pride. "6 months ago," Milan began, "I was invisible. I thought kindness was something you did quietly in corners. But I learned something important. Kindness isn't meant to be invisible. It is meant to be a beacon, a bold declaration that everyone, absolutely everyone, deserves to be understood." As the applause washed over her, Milan caught sight of a banner at the back of the room. It read, "Kindness always comes full circle." And standing there, looking out at the sea of faces, Milan finally knew the truth. Your circle might be exactly what someone is waiting for. You just have to be brave enough to step out of the shadows and say, "Hello, may I help you?"